Hello and welcome to the final Breaking Ground show of 2023 on iPropertyRadio with myself, Carol Tallon, the show where we chat to industry experts to get a view on what's happening on the ground and to learn about new trends emerging within the construction industry. This show is brought to you in partnership with Place Engage, a data-driven platform for more successful public consultation and community engagement for your next development project. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by returning guest Pat Barry, CEO of the Irish Green Building Council, and of course, Chair of the European Regional Network of the World Green Building Council. Pat, welcome back. It's great to chat to you today.
Many thanks for having me on, Carol.
As you know, I'm a huge fan and advocate of the work that you're doing there within the Irish Green Building Council and now kind of more broadly, kind of the World Green Building Council. And in the last number of weeks, you've been involved in a very important conference for Ireland. So you might just talk to us a little bit about maybe the initiatives of the Irish Green Building Council in 2023, culminating in the conference last week.
Well, I suppose in 2023, we've been involved in quite a number of initiatives, ranging from trying to popularize the understanding of things like embodied carbon and whole life carbon, which is about moving beyond just looking at the energy use within a building, but looking at the materials that go into creating that building. And we've been doing a lot of work around creating baselines for what's typical practice in Ireland for construction. We've also been working quite a lot on circularity, circularity in construction. How do we get better use out of our materials and maintain materials in longer continuous loops of reuse? So we've been working across a whole range of issues in 2023. And I suppose our conference on Friday was very much focused on housing, with a key theme. One key theme is really looking at a combination of creating homes for climate adaptation that can withstand what we are starting to experience and have experienced over the summer, extreme heat, extreme rainfall and flooding, and how do we design homes to better cope with that future. We also looked at how we can be more efficient in the type of homes that we build. We've been working with UCD on a study which looked at density, the impact of and costs of the infrastructure between the homes that we build. If lower density homes can quite often consume a lot of materials that goes into the infrastructure and roads and manholes and lighting, and set out recommendations on how we can reduce the cost of that for the home builder and for the home buyer.
It's definitely been a busy 2023. One of the things that I've seen, and certainly we see it a lot across maybe tech adoption across the built environment, that a lot of work can be done over a decade, and then with incremental increases, but actually the jumps tend to happen all at once. So these things come together, and certainly the last 2 years feels a little bit like that in terms of how the industry has maybe embraced some of the concepts that you're talking about there. It's interesting to hear you talk about part of the work of the Irish Green Building Council as to popularise terms like embodied carbon and circularity across the construction industry, because it almost seems like that shouldn't be important, that actually if the drivers are policy and compliance to meet standards and to meet Ireland's 2050 ambitions, it almost seems that popularising it shouldn't be an issue, that it should be a case of people complying. But we know that that's not the full story, and that the culture is a huge part of this. So you might just maybe talk to me a little bit about how you're bringing the industry along with you and project owners along with you.
Well, I suppose over the past 2 years, there has been a little bit of a sea change, or a major sea change in how developers and the construction industry sees sustainability. Whereas before it would have been very much focused on just minimum compliance. The realization is that, there's a far wider context out there. For example, European directive has introduced the sustainable finance regulatory directive. There's the EU taxonomy, which is now starting to set requirements around. It's really the EU taxonomy is around tackling greenwashing and stating what can and cannot be declared as green lending. So that is filtered through to the industry, and they're realizing that they can't just wait for national regulations. They have to look at what's happening internationally, because if you're trying to get finance, international finance, or even national finance, you now have to look beyond building regulations.
We know, and we've discussed it previously on the show, that the sustainable finance regulations have certainly been a huge driver. And I suppose I am very conscious of your position, as I mentioned at the top of the show there, that in addition to your work with the Irish Green Building Council, you are currently the chair of the European Regional Network of the World Green Building Council. So that gives you maybe a more global perspective on where Ireland sits in terms of our policies, our regulations, but also in terms of the culture of the industry. And you're absolutely right. Before we came on air, you and I were discussing that there has been a change in recent times. It's something we see across our clients. And, I'm not sure if, certainly I wouldn't describe some of the activities that went before it as greenwashing, but I think they were maybe very naive attempts to do their best, not understanding what their best would be. And that's why projects like establishing the baselines of buildings and across the industry are very important. I know it's something that many of our clients fed into the work that you and your team were doing. And we've spoken to your colleague, Stephen, actually about that project earlier this summer. So really encouraging construction and project owners to get involved and talk about their, share data on their projects, so that we can actually start to understand the scale of the problem we're dealing with. But given your global perspective and maybe the lack of data, although I know that is improving in Ireland, are you able to measure how Ireland is performing right now?
Well, I suppose the range. Europe is quite diverse, so you have countries like Scandinavia, Holland, France, who are moving ahead quite quickly, and other countries, in Southern Europe or in Central Europe, which are probably not moving quite as fast. So you do have a diversity across the whole of Europe. Ireland sits somewhere closer to the Nordics, or slightly behind the Nordics and the French and the Dutch. But I think we are not as far behind as some may think we are, because I think we're quite good in Ireland at, because we're a small country, we're very good at taking on change and seeing trends and adapting to them. So I think that Ireland's in a very good position to catch up very quickly and really understand, the impact of the new regulations coming from Europe.
That's a really positive thing to hear, because I think there has been a certain amount of mixed messaging over the number of years. And I think that it's not even mixed messaging, it's maybe our understanding of some of these concepts are growing. But actually, as our understanding grows, sometimes it's important to make, that we agree on definitions and we agree on things. And I think the EU taxonomy is going to be really fundamental in that. But even referring back to the conference that happened recently, the Better Homes Conference, can you take us back to basics just a little and say, in the Irish context, what is a better home?
Well, I suppose we have defined better homes really through we have a certification system called Home Performance Index. Now, we're not necessarily asking everybody to get certified, but what it does is it gives a really good framework for what a sustainable home is, because it looks at about 35 different indicators for sustainability, looking at a much broader range of environmental indicators, say, than the BER, but also health and well-being indicators and economic indicators. So it is a good start for anybody trying to understand what a better home is by just downloading that manual. And it's very much designed for Ireland. It's very much integrates Irish building regulations, national policy on climate, but very much aligned with all of the European directives, like taxonomy, the new incoming energy performance of buildings directive. So I think we developed this very much as an education tool as well, so that any architect, any developer can look through it and understand immediately what indicators need to be measured. And sometimes it's very simple, cost-free measures that can be integrated, like water efficiency is one that we've identified as a gap. It's it's largely cost-free. It's something you can integrate low flow showers, low flow taps at no real additional cost. There's other things like location, like embodied carbon, all of which, if are considered very early in the design of homes, can have a huge impact in improving the quality for the future occupants.
And Pat, in terms of the home performance index, and it is a very comprehensive, almost toolkit, if I could describe it as that. And by the way, I will include a link to the resources actually with this recording here for anybody who's interested. But in terms of the communications out, the fact that you have integrated national policy on climate, you have integrated kind of building regulations, and of course the new energy performance directive, encompassing all of that. Who is this communicated to? I mean, are you trying to target the design teams? Is there a role for planners in understanding and maybe providing for this, or are you speaking directly to the project owners? Where is this landing, and is there a different message for each?
Well, I suppose at the conference on Friday, we had a couple of speakers who were talking about the benefits of using the Home Performance Index. We had Charlie Conlon from Ballymore, and he was talking about how it kind of creates a common communication tool between the developer and his design team, in that they're, once they have it on the table, they're all working to the same goal. So they understand what needs to be done to deliver sustainable homes. So it really needs to be, we're really trying to communicate to the developers that, if you start engaging with your design team about the system, you get a better product, because even if you don't go for certification, because suddenly the architects and your design team realize that there might have been things that they didn't consider before that can simply be integrated cost-free into a development that really improve the quality.
And I like that toolkit being described almost as a common communication between the design team and the project owners, because that's such a fundamental first step. But how does it filter down across the supply chain? Because one thing about how the business of construction in Ireland operates is that actually you need everybody on board to be able to deliver on the promises that are set out from the early stage, whether it's design or from the project owners. So how is the supply chain being brought along with this?
Well, I suppose there's a number of ways that it filters through. For example, we look for the system encourages you to look for environmental product declarations. So they're transparent declarations from a supplier as to the environmental impact of all of the materials supplied to the home. So by simply asking for those, not all producers have environmental product declarations, but simply once the architect says, well, in order to achieve this credit, we need a certain number of environmental product declarations. Once architects start asking for these, or the developers ask for these, then that changes the supply chain because they start to be produced. And once there is a critical mass of those environmental product declarations in the market, then manufacturers are comparing their environmental impacts with their competitor, and that then drives down the impact. So that's at the product level. But then we also look at things like air tightness, thermal bridging, and that all filters down then to the on-site construction workers, where we encourage upskilling of construction staff, and that is reflected then in the credits within the tool, because you can get additional credits if the site staff are trained up to a certain level, around energy efficiency and thermal bridging and air tightness.
Pat, I'm going to ask you a question that I ought to have asked maybe 2 or 3 years ago when we had our first conversation. How does Green Building Council define sustainability?
Well, we define sustainability very much around working within the ecological limits of the planet. There's a very good framework which you may be familiar, known as donut economics, and there's a number of key scientific indicators that we've already, scientific boundaries that we've already surpassed, including, global warming, extraction of water, land use conversion. So really it's about developing the whole construction sector within the ecological limits of the planet, whilst maintaining a floor, ensuring that everybody on the planet actually has the necessities that they need, like housing, access to water, and all of those things that are essential to human life.
I think we are increasingly getting to the stage where how we define sustainability is going to be the decider of maybe the cultural shift for the critical mass we need, for the change that we need to see. And I just don't know. I've been doing some research about this recently, and I just don't know if it's very clearly defined as to what that means in a construction context. And so I appreciate what you're saying there, and I understand about the ecological limits of the planet. And I'm always interested to see, does that mean preserving and maintaining the status quo, or does it mean that imperative to innovate and use emerging technologies to almost expand the ecological limits of the planet? And I'm just, it's something that I'm unclear on, and I think there's some really interesting research happening at the moment. And I appreciate it's difficult for policymakers to make policy on foot of that, but it feels like something that is unsettled at this stage. And I just wonder, is that feeding into maybe, we're falling so short. Ireland is falling so short, say on our 2030 targets at this stage. It seems difficult to see how we'll make up those. And if we miss those by a long shot, where does that leave us in terms of our 2050 goals and targets? And construction is just one part of that, but it feels like the more we get into it, the less we know, and that's probably a normal part of it. But for the construction industry, in terms of trying to do the right thing, do we can we agree as an industry and the policymakers providing policy for that industry, can we agree on what the right targets should be in a way that we actually have some hope of achieving them, do you think?
Well, I suppose I'm not sure I would agree that we don't have a defined definition of sustainability. I think internationally there are things such as science-based targets that we are working to. Also within the Paris Agreement, we are signed up to achieve certain targets. To limit global warming by 1.5 degrees. And it's possible then to translate that down to the construction level as to what that means. And that's what we have been doing. And that's what we did as part of the Building Life work last year, where we actually modeled the total impact of developing the national development plan over the next 10 years. And what that meant in terms of global science-based targets. So it is not just so whilst you can mitigate a lot of, and we will mitigate a lot of carbon emissions by technology, we can't just rely on technology. And there's a term that has now been used very much within Europe called sufficiency as well. And really what that means is being a lot more efficient in how we deliver construction, how we are more space efficient, how we make better use of vacant space that's already within our towns and cities. And that all, and that's where we come back to this whole thing of donut economics as well. How do we deliver the needs of the Irish people without blowing the global budget? Even if you look at how we deliver housing, can we deliver the right size and type of units? Which is not, we've a tendency just to focus on families, but we need a range of smaller units for all different types of family sizes. And I think we could be a lot more efficient there. So I wouldn't necessarily agree that we don't have targets. I think we very much do have targets. And I don't think there's any doubt anymore about what we need to do.
And that's absolutely fair. I accept that, and I suppose you're talking about the needs of the Irish people, maybe as defined and underpinned in the national development plan and in our national planning framework. But the reality is, we know that the demographics there are not correct. We know that they are underestimated. And it's interesting. I had the opportunity to interview Ronan Lyons on this very topic. We actually raised the question, why does Ireland, or why do the Irish government almost consistently underestimate Ireland's growth? And he gave a really interesting theory, and you'll have to listen back to the interview with Ronan Lyons to hear his theory on it. I won't even try to relay it here, but it is an interesting one. But it's one that, irrespective of his theory on why it happens, the reality is that we do almost consistently underestimate Ireland's growth, not just in terms of the economy, but actually in terms of our population changes and the breakdown in the typology. The underestimating the demographics gives us this mismatch of housing typologies when we look at housing need and demand, and that has a very real consequence. It has a real consequence in housing, it has a real consequence in health, it has a real consequence in our public transport. We're only talking about housing, but there is a real consequence to that I don't want to say invalidates, because obviously we have to work on something, but again, the data that we're working on is clearly imperfect. Should that stop us working on it? No, of course. But I think we need to acknowledge that it is imperfect and find ways to improve it.
Well, I suppose we do have data. It's just that we're not using it. I give you the example. Last year, the average size of home delivered was 123 square meters, which is a 4-bedroom home. The average household size, according to the CSO statistics was 2.7. That went up from about 2.5 in 2016 because all our adult children are coming home to live with us, because they've nowhere to go, because we're not providing the right sized, right type of homes for them. Instead, we're building large family homes. So we've got a mismatch between what has been provided and been built. And if we actually built with the same square meterage output, we built 29,000 houses last year. We actually perfectly matched our housing requirements with the demographics. We could have built 55,000 houses last year with the same output.
Yeah, that's so stark when you put it like that, and it actually just shows the importance of interpreting the data correctly. And I think you've raised a really interesting question. Actually, we do have the data, so why are we not using it? And actually, just at the National Property Summit in the last week, I had the opportunity to interview placemaker. Oh gosh, I'm sorry, Ali Harvey, and she spoke about not just the need for data, but she actually made the point where you've no data, you've no crisis. So sometimes it's not convenient for policymakers to know all the data. And I just thought it was a very compelling point she made, that no data equals no crisis. And I mean, maybe that will go some way into answering the question, if we have data, why are we not using it to inform policy?
But I suppose the reason I raise this point is because this has serious consequences for climate, because every wasted square meter of area is half a ton of carbon. And we waste labor, space. We're not housing people, and we're making the climate crisis worse.
You break that down into every square meter wasted is a half ton of carbon. I'm looking at people who are homeless or living in hotels or hostels or completely inadequate accommodation. So I absolutely agree with you. The consequences of failing to interpret this data, it's very real. It's real for the environment. It's real for our people. It's real for our housing policy. It's real for our healthcare. It's real for our education. It's real for everything. So that maybe needs to come back to why the industry needs to be feeding in data in a much better way. And that's why we were so happy to interview your colleague Stephen and contribute case studies and encourage the industry to contribute case studies, so that some baseline data could start to be established. I know MMC Ireland are doing a similar project right now to try understand some of the data across offsite and the other modern methods of construction categories. And it is so important as an industry that we arm ourselves with the data so that actually the right policy can be born out of that. So look, thank you so much for your patience with me today, because these are things that I'm curious about and I don't fully understand, and sometimes it's difficult to find the right people to ask the questions. So Pat, today you're it. You were the person in front of me, so you get the questions. Thank you so much. Before we finish up today, because I am conscious of your time, you touched on, say, the Energy Performance of Building Directive and what's likely to be coming down the track in 2024 that will impact the built environment. You might just give us maybe your thoughts on what we can expect for the next 12 to 18 months.
Well, I suppose the Energy Performance of Building Directive has now largely been agreed in Europe. So in 2024 should see the implementation of that. So that includes things like introduction of minimum energy performance. It includes the requirement within 3 years to include whole life carbon measurement in the on the BER. So you'll have to calculate your embodied carbon by the 1st of January 2027 and include it on your BER. So that will drive a whole range of new industries. And I suppose, whilst I did talk about the need for space efficiency and efficient use of materials, we also need the technology to catch up. We will need new forms of construction. The government has set up a working group around timber, which I'm participating on, and that'll be working through 2024 to try and see if there's a way to enable more use of timber at above 4 stories, so we could start to see apartment blocks being built entirely out of timber. So there will be an awful lot happening in 2024 at a regulatory level and at a guidance level, particularly around the implementation of the BBD.
Pat, thank you so much for taking us through those. Every time I have a discussion with you, things just become a little clearer, and this is quite a complex area, and we do try to break down some of not just the language and the terminology, but also maybe some of the changes. And this is such a fast changing place area of the industry. You mentioned there about that sea change that has been happening over the last 2 years, and it's clear that's set to continue for another year or two as well. So thank you for the work that you and your team do in the Irish Green Building Council, actually, to take us through that and translate that to bring the industry along with you. I genuinely appreciate it. That was Pat Barry, CEO of the Irish Green Building Council and Chair of the European Regional Network of the World Green Building Council. Thanks to our show producer, Katie Tallon, and to the production team at Hear Me Roar Media. And of course, thanks to Place Engage for making these conversations possible. Thank you to all for tuning in, not just today, but for this year. And this is, again, our final show of 2023. We look forward to joining you in 2024 again. We wish all of our listeners a wonderful Christmas and a happy new year. And we look forward to catching you on the other side with the next episode of Breaking Ground in 2024. In the meantime, please be sure to check out all of the other Irish and international real estate and construction shows on iProperty Radio.